Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We have a massive stack of documents on the virtual desk today, and honestly, looking through this material, it feels less like we are reviewing a piece of entertainment news and more like we are, I don't know, performing a forensic audit on a crime scene.
That is exactly the vibe, isn't it? We are sifting through the wreckage of what was supposed to be a massive cultural touchstone, trying to figure out what actually caused the crash.
And if you've been anywhere near the internet in the last 6 months, you know that this particular wreckage is still smoking. We are, of course, talking about the cancellation of the Star Wars series, The Acolyte.
Yeah.
This wasn't just a show getting axed. It was a full-blown cultural skirmish. It felt like lines were drawn in the sand, like, immediately.
It really was. It was a collision of two completely different realities. On one side, you have the online discourse, the screaming matches, the review mamming accusations, the culture war narratives about toxic fandoms. And then on the other side, completely separate from that, have the corporate, the quiet, cold rooms where accountants are just tallying up the...
And that is our mission today. We are going to try to separate those two realities. We are basing this deep dive on a very extensive analysis from the Trent Report. And this source is interesting because it really, really tries to push past the emotional arguments in the finger point to look specifically at the hard data.
Which is so refreshing because usually this topic is handled with a lot of heat and very little light. We're going to be looking at comments from the C-suite at Disney, candid interviews with the showrunner Leslie Headland, and most importantly, we are going to break down the Nielsen viewership numbers and the production.
The goal here is to answer the question that everyone seems to be yelling about. Why was The Acolyte actually canceled? Was it the toxic bros on Twitter? Was it the woke agenda? Or was it something much more boring and, frankly, much more devastating?
Spoiler alert. The source suggests the answer is math. Simple, unfeeling math.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we get to the boring but devastating math, we have to acknowledge the chaos. We have to set the scene with the hook.
Of course.
The prevailing narrative, at least the one that was heavily pushed by the creative team and certain media outlets, is that The Acolyte was a victim.
Right. The narrative is that this was a targeted hit job, that the show, never even stood a chance.
Exactly. And the source highlights a viewpoint that was championed by folks like Jacob Suggs, the co-host of the That's Just Great podcast. He represents a very vocal, very passionate group of fans who believe that Disney, and I want to quote him directly here, pandered to the worst, loudest people online.
This is the online hate theory. It's the idea that the cancellation wasn't a business decision, but a capitulation. The argument is that the intense review bombing, specifically around, intersectional feminism and woke ideologies, created such a toxic cloud around the show that Disney got scared and pulled the plug.
Suggs calls it deeply upsetting and frustrating that the series never had a chance to grow. And, I mean, if you look at the Rotten Tomatoes user scores versus the critic scores, you can see where that frustration comes from. The gap was massive. It looked like a coordinated attack.
Oh, let's be very clear about that. The toxicity was real. The internet is not a polite place, and the Star Wars fandom has a very volatile, very loud fringe element. Nobody is denying that people were saying nasty things online.
No, not at all.
But, and here is where the source pivots hard, we have to ask a much more difficult question. Does that toxicity actually influence a decision of this magnitude?
That's the million-dollar question, or, as we'll see later, the quarter-billion-dollar question. We tend to think that because we see the angry tweets, Bob Iger is sitting in his office sweating over them.
And the source argues that is a complete delusion. It really challenges you, the listener, to think about the power dynamic here. Disney is a multinational, multi-billion-dollar conglomerate.
I mean, they're a giant.
A giant. They've weathered controversies for 100 years. They have armies of PR people. The idea that a user named JediKiller99 on Twitter can force the Walt Disney Company to scrap a massive asset simply by being mean, it doesn't hold up to scrutiny.
It paints a picture of these fans thinking they are puppeteers, right? Like they have this totally inflated sense of agency that if they just type in all caps, they can change the direction of a Fortune 500 company.
It's completely detached from reality. I mean, think about it from a shareholder perspective. If a show is profitable, if it is driving subscriptions, retaining users, selling merchandise, and keeping people on the platform...
And who cares what Twitter says?
Disney will happily ignore every angry tweet in existence. They are in the business of profit, not popularity contest. If The Acolyte was making money, it would still be on the air, regardless of what the comments section...
So if we strip away the idea that the haters killed it, we are left with the uncomfortable question, who did? If it wasn't the angry mob with their pitchforks, what was it? This brings us to section 1, the corporate reality check.
This is where we have to swap the emotional lens for the financial one. We need to look at what the people signing the checks actually said.
The source points us to Disney Entertainment co-chairman Alan Berg. Now, Anyone who follows corporate news knows that executives are, well, they're trained to never say anything interesting.
They speak in code. It's all buzzwords.
Exactly. But in a statement to Vulture regarding the cancellation, Bergman said something that the source identifies as a funeral notice.
It was a very specific choice of, he started with the polite part. We were happy with the creative.
Which is the classic, it's not you, it's me of the corporate world. We love the art. We really did.
Right. But then comes the hammer drop. He continued, but the performance wasn't there given the cost structure.
Even the cost structure. It sounds like something you'd just sleep through in an Econ 101 class. But let's stop and really parse that. What is he actually saying there?
In the C-suite, cost structure is a polite, sanitized way of talking about ROI, return on investment. When Bergman says that, he is explicitly telling shareholders, we spent X amount of dollars, we only made Y amount of value in return, and the math doesn't work.
That's it.
He isn't talking about theme. He isn't talking about casting. He isn't talking about political backlash. He is looking at a ledger. One column is red, one is black, and they did not balance.
It's dangerously simple when you put it that way. It's not about feelings, it's about efficiency.
It's all it is. And notice what he didn't blame. He didn't blame the fans. He didn't blame the marketing. He didn't blame review. He blamed the relationship between the cost and the performance.
And it's not just the suit saying that. You might think, well, of course the executive focuses on money. But the source draws a really interesting line to Leslie Headland, the showrunner herself. Now, usually when a show gets canned this fast, the creator goes on the defensive. They blame the network or the time slot or, yes, the toxic fans.
But look at her interview with The Wrap. It is surprisingly candid. She didn't go on some big crusade.
She admitted she was surprised by the swiftness of the cancellation, basically how fast the axe fell and how public it was. But she said she was not surprised by the result.
That is a massive admission, not surprised by the result.
She said, and I'm quoting here, once I was getting particular phone calls about the reaction and the criticism and the viewership, I felt like, okay, the writing's on the wall.
The writing's on the wall. I mean, even the person at the helm, the creative lead who lived and breathed this project for years, looked at the data coming in and realized it wasn't sustainable.
That really deflates the sabotage narrative, doesn't it? Because if the fans were just hate watching or if everyone was tuning in just to see how bad it was, the numbers would still be huge. Hate watching counts as a view, right?
That is such a crucial point. A view is a view. The algorithms do not care if you watched it with a smile or a frown. If millions of people were hate watching The Acolyte, Leslie Headland would be preparing season 2 right now. Itself, the fact that she knew it was over implies that the viewership simply wasn't there, hateful or otherwise.
So the showrunner knew, the executives knew, but let's look at what they were looking at. Let's actually look at the spreadsheet. Section 2, the data deep dive. We have the Nielsen ratings here, provided by the source, and frankly, context is absolutely king here.
Oh, absolutely. Raw numbers are meaningless without a baseline. You have to compare apples to apples, or in this case, Jedi to Jedi.
Let's start with the premiere. The Acolyte launched with a strategy that usually boosts numbers. They dropped 2 episodes at once. According to the Nielsen data in the source, it racked up 488 million minutes viewed in that opening window.
488 million minutes. Now, to you or me, that sounds like a staggering amount of time. Nearly 500 million minutes. If you just saw that number in a headline, you'd think, wow, huge hit.
Until you look at The Neighbors, let's look at Ahsoka. That also had a 2-episode premiere, so it's a perfect direct comparison.
Okay, so apples to apples.
It pulled in 829 million minutes.
Whoa. So The Acolyte did roughly 58% of the traffic Ahsoka did. That is a steep drop. You've lost almost half the audience of the previous show right out of it.
It gets worse when you compare it to the heavy hitter. Look at The Mandalorian Season 3. A single episode premiere, just one episode, did 823 million minutes.
Okay, stop and think about the math there. The Acolyte had roughly 2 hours of content available for people to watch to rack up those minutes. Mando had maybe, 40 or 45 minutes?
Something like that.
And Mando still nearly doubled the total minutes viewed. That means the engagement per minute of available content for The Acolyte was just a fraction of what Mando pulled.
And the kicker, the one that really hurts according to the source, is the Book of Boba Fett. Now, culturally, people have very mixed feelings about that show. It's often cited as a weak point in the saga.
For sure.
But statistically, its a single episode premiere beat The Acolyte's 2-episode premiere.
That is the alarm bell right there. When you are losing to the mixed reception show despite having a mathematical advantage of double the runtime, you are in serious trouble. The source note, The Acolyte was the second least viewed premiere Star Wars show plus her, only beating Skeleton Crew.
So It started at the bottom, and shows can grow, right? We've seen it happen. I mean, Breaking Bad started slow. Game of Thrones built an audience over time. Did we see any word-of-mouth growth here?
That's always the hope, isn't it? You hope for that water cooler effect. But the source analyzes the run, and unfortunately, the trajectory was the complete opposite. The Mandalorian had legs, people kept watching, rewatching, telling their friends. The Acolyte numbers, they just bled out. It was a slow leak that turned into...
Which brings us to the finale, the big conclusion. The moment everything is revealed, you'd expect a spike, right? Even if people checked out in the middle, they usually come back to see how it all ends.
You would hope so. That's usually what happens.
The stat, 335 million minutes viewed.
335 million. That is shockingly low for a franchise finale of this size.
It placed 10th on Nielsen's streaming originals chart. The source notes this was the lowest Nielsen recorded viewership for a Star Wars finale at the time.
And we have to remind the listener about how Nielsen methodology works, because the source makes a very smart point. Nielsen doesn't just count the people watching episode 8. They count all viewing minutes for the title during that week.
Right. So if I decided to finally start the show that week and I binged episodes 1 through 8, all of those minutes are in that 335 million bucket.
Exactly. If the show was gaining traction, if people were saying, hey, you got to check this out, it's getting good, you would see a massive number there from catch-up. That's what usually happens with hit shows. The finale week is huge because everyone is catching up.
So what does this number tell us?
A 335 million total implies that not only was nobody watching the finale, but nobody was starting the show either. It was a ghost town.
It effectively means the audience had abandoned ship.
Completely. Compare that to Mando, where the charts stay hot for weeks after the finale because people are rewatching. The Acolyte just poof, it evaporated. It fell out of the cultural conversation instantly.
Okay, so we've established that the performance part of Alan Bergman's statement was bad. Viewership was objectively low. But remember, he said, performance given the cost structure. Low viewership isn't always a death sentence if you're cheap to make.
Right. You can survive being niche if you have a niche budget.
Which brings us to section 3.
Yeah.
The financials. The cost of failure. And folks, if you thought the viewership numbers were rough, hold on to your wallets, because this is where the business case really, truly collapses.
This is where the math goes from unfortunate to catastrophic.
The source cites a Forbes report by Carolyn Reed from September 2025. We're looking at a gross production cost of $230.8 million.
$230 million for one season of television. That is the GDP of a small island nation. It's just staggering.
That breaks down to $46.2 million per hour of content.
That is astronomical. Even in the era of prestige TV, even compared to Rings of Power or Stranger Things, that is a massive.
Now, to be fair, the source does note there was a UK tax credit of about $43.8 million. Disney is smart with their accounting. So the net spend, what actually left the bank account, was around $187.
Okay, but even at the discounted rate, let's just do the division. You're talking about roughly $28 million to $32 million per episode.
Let that sink in for a second. $30 million for an episode that runs maybe 35 to 40 minutes.
To put that in perspective, that is the budget of a decent-sized, mid-tier sci-fi movie spent every single week. When you are spending that kind of money, you don't just need good ratings. You don't need standard Star Wars ratings. You need cultural phenomenon ratings. You need the entire world to stop and watch.
And the source does a really interesting comparison here to show just how out of whack this is. They compare it to the Arrowverse shows on the CW. You know, The Flash, Arrow, Supergirl.
Right, the superhero soap operas from about a decade ago.
Yeah. Now, those shows look, let's just say, efficient. They didn't have movie-quality CGI. The costumes were a bit letter-heavy.
They definitely had a certain...
They did. But the source notes that those shows cost about $2.2 million to $3 million per episode.
So literally 10% of the cost of The Acolyte. You can make an entire season of The Flash for the cost of one single episode of The Acolyte.
And here's the kicker. At their peak, those CW shows were pulling in 3 to 6 million views.
This is the aha moment for the financial argument. This is the ROI lesson right here. You have a show like The Flash spending pennies, comparatively speaking, and getting an audience of 3, 4, 5 million people. That is a money printing machine. It's cheap, it's popular, the margins are huge. It justifies its existence on the balance sheet.
Then you have The Acolyte, spending $30 million an episode and struggling to get engagement that matches shows from 10 years ago that cost a fraction of the price.
It paints a very, very clear picture of why the show was canceled. It's not about quality art versus bad art. It's about sustainable business. You cannot spend Ferrari money to get Honda Civic performance. It doesn't matter if the Ferrari has a great mess. If you are running a taxi service, you cannot afford to drive a Ferrari if you're only getting the business model fundamental.
The source argues this completely destroys the spin.
Right.
No amount of PR, no amount of review bombing excuses can hide the fact that the show failed the math test. It didn't deliver the sustained audience engagement required to justify a $250 $250 million price tag.
And honestly, when you look at it that way, the cancellation feels less like a political statement and more like a simple corporate course correction. They try to go big, they spent the money, the audience didn't show up, so they cut their losses. It's standard business practice.
But wait, we have to address the elephant in the room. There is still that lingering argument from the other side, the ideological argument, the idea that Disney caved to the anti-woke crowd.
Right. Theory is that even if the money was bad, Disney would have kept it going if they weren't afraid of the backlash. The accusation is that they got scared of and wanted to distance themselves from woke.
And this is where the source brings out what I think is their strongest piece of evidence. It's what they call the Percy Jackson control.
I love this comparison because it really isolates the variable. It's almost scientific in its approach.
So the source introduces Percy Jackson and the another major Disney Plus series. Now, according to the source, and remember we are reporting their analysis here, Percy Jackson pushes the same woke agenda that critics claim the act.
The source is arguing that if you look at the casting diverse, race swapping from the source, if you look at the themes, the modernization of the myths, Percy Jackson fits into that same progressive bucket that the anti-woke YouTubers were attacking the act.
Exactly. It checks the same box. The same critics on YouTube were making videos about Percy Jackson ruining childhoods, just like they were about the act. So if the theory is Disney cancels things because of anti-woke backlash, then Percy Jackson should be dead in the water.
Right. It should be.
The haters should have killed that too.
Logic would dictate that, yes. If online complaints about ideology were the driving force, Percy Jackson would be on the chopping block right alongside the Jedi.
But it was renewed.
Renewed for a third season, in fact, as of March 2025. Not just renewed, but thriving.
So why? Why does one woke show get the axe and the other gets a renewal? Why didn't the toxic fans kill Percy Jackson?
We go right back to the metric showdown. It's the math again. It's always the math.
Let's look at the numbers the source provides. Percy Jackson premiered 572 million minutes.
Beating the Acolyte's 488 million right out of the gate, a solid lead.
Total views for 2024 using Luminate data. Percy Jackson had over 3 billion minutes watched. The Acolyte was estimated at around 2.3 billion.
So significantly higher consumption. The audience showed up and, crucially, they stayed. It had legs.
And the cost. This is the most critical part of the equation. Percy Jackson cost significantly less. The source puts it at $12 million to $15 million per episode.
Okay, stop right there. Let's do the math. Percy Jackson costs half as much, maybe even a third as much as the act.
And it gets more viewers.
That's the ballgame, isn't it? That is the definitive proof, according to the source. The renewal of Percy Jackson proves that Disney does not care about the ideological content or the online complaints. They are completely agnostic about, they care about the
high views plus lower cost renewal. Low views plus astronomical cost equals cancellation.
It really is that simple. The source argues that if woke criticism was the reason for cancellation, Percy Jackson, the fact that it's thriving proves that Disney isn't afraid of the hater. They are afraid of bad margin. They will publish the most progressive content in the world if it makes a profit, and they will cancel the most traditional content in the world if it loses money.
It kind of busts the myth that the haters have all this power.
It really does. It suggests that the haters are irrelevant if the general audience shows. Percy Jackson had its critics too, purists who didn't like the changes, but enough people watched it that the critics matter. The Acolyte, well, the general audience didn't show up. The silent majority simply wasn't.
This leads us to the final section of our deep dives today, the philosophical conclusion. The source takes a step back from the spreadsheet and looks at the power dynamic between the fan and the corporation, because a lot of fans feel helpless, or they feel like they need to fight for their content.
This is where the source gets a bit fiery about the concept of shill power.
The source argues that online critics, YouTubers, the tweeters, they don't influence Bob Iger. Money influences Bob Iger.
The source describes those who blame fans for the cancellation as being detached from reality. It's a harsh assessment, but the logic is that they are attributing power to critics that critics simply do not possess.
It's like believing the weatherman causes the rain. The critics are just reporting on the storm. They aren't creating it. The storm is the market.
And the source pivots to a really specific, almost poetic, cinematic reference here to drive this home. Did you catch that?
I did. It was totally unexpected. Kingdom of Heaven, the Ridley Scott.
Specifically, the scene involving King Baldwin IV, the Leper King, and Bailey, played by Orlando. It's a moment about...
It's a heavy quote. King Baldwin says, no matter how a man moves you, when you stand before God, you still have to answer for your choice.
It's dramatic, sure, but apply it to this context. The source is using this to argue for individual age.
Basically saying, stop worrying about stopping Disney or fighting the corporation. Stop blaming the haters or the shills. Just make your own choice.
Right. The argument is that fans shouldn't obsess over some grand war of duty. They shouldn't feel like they are soldiers or they should exercise their power. No.
So if you think a show is, what was the phrase?
crash that is trying to indoctrinate us. That's how the source puts it. If you believe that, you don't need to launch a campaign. You don't need to harass the actors. You just need to not watch it.
It sounds so simple, but in the age of engagement farming, it's almost revolutionary. The most powerful thing you can do is nothing.
Indifference is the ultimate weapon against a corporation. Anger is engagement. Hate watching is still watching. If you tweet about how much you hate it, you are helping the algorithm. You are trending the topic. But indifference, silent, that kills a show faster than any angry review.
The source frames this as a moral stance on consumerism.
Yeah.
You are responsible for what you consume. You answer for your choices.
It shifts the conversation from Disney failed us or the fans failed us to we have the power of the remote. It's a call to autonomy. Don't like it. Turn it off. If enough people turn it off, the math takes over and the show goes away, just like the Acolyte.
So let's bring it all home. We've looked at the accusations, the corporate statements, the Nielsen ratings, the budget, and the control group of Percy Jackson.
And when you stack all of that up, the conclusion from the source is just, it's undeniable. The Acolyte didn't fail because of a culture war. It failed a math test.
It cost $250 million and had the second lowest premiere and lowest finale viewership in Star Wars TV history.
You can't spin those numbers. And the Percy Jackson comparison puts the final nail in the coffin of the ideology argument. Ideology doesn't kill shows. Bad margins do.
It's a huge reality check for everyone, fans, critics, and executives alike.
It is. It reminds us that show business is two words, and without the business part, the show doesn't happen.
Here is a final thought for you to chew on, something to mull over now that we've dissected all this data. The source ends with that sentiment about consumer power and the irrelevance of online noise.
Right.
So if billion-dollar corporations only respond to the bottom line, and if online noise is statistically irrelevant compared to the silent majority of viewers, does engaging in culture war debates on social media actually achieve anything?
It feeds the algorithm, certainly. It keeps us angry. It generates clicks.
But does it change the outcome? Or is the only real vote the one you cast with your remote control?
That is the question, isn't it? Are we all just screaming into the void, or are we voting with our eyes?
Something to think about the next time you see a trending hashtag. Thanks for listening to this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.
Stay curious.